Well, actually, the Titanic was a cover for a top secret military operation I was doing. When we lost a nuclear submarine called the USS Scorpion, it was carrying nuclear weapon.
Everyone knows how Titanic sank, but almost no one knows what happened to her back half. And the reason for that silence is far more disturbing than the sinking itself. For over a century, the most dramatic, most violent, and most revealing section of that wreck has been quietly kept out of the story. Not because it's boring, not because there's nothing to say, but because what the stern tells us, if you actually look at it honestly, threatens something that powerful institutions spent decades carefully protecting.
A sense of remorse, a sense of, we shouldn't be celebrating anything. We're at the spot where this amazing tragedy, this amazing drama had unfolded.
We've all seen the bow, majestic, haunting, preserved in the cold dark like a monument. But 600 meters away, something else was waiting on that ocean floor. Something that no documentary lingers on. Something that the official investigations of 1912 went to extraordinary lengths to make sure the world would never fully understand. What you're about to hear is the part of the Titanic story they never wanted you to ask about. The story carved into stones, in the days. Following April 15th, 1912, as the shock of the disaster spread across 2 continents, an overwhelming demand arose from both the public and governments on both sides of the Atlantic. The demand for truth. How could a ship that represented the pinnacle of human engineering, described by the men who built her as nearly unsinkable, be brought down on her very first voyage?
What anybody who's explored the wreck finds is pairs of shoes.
2 of the most powerful official investigations in modern maritime history were quickly assembled. In Washington, Senator William Alden Smith, a Michigan lawmaker known for his relentless, almost combative questioning style, moved with remarkable speed. He opened hearings just 3 days after the first survivors arrived in New York, hauling witnesses directly off the docked RMS Carpathia before anyone could slip away. Across the Atlantic in London, Lord Mersey, formerly John Bigham, a former president of the Probate, Divorce, and Admiralty Division, presided over the British Wreck Commissioners. Inquiry with a manner survivors described as coolly skeptical of anything that deviated from orderly testimony. These were not ceremonial proceedings. They represented the full machinery of the state, set in motion for one purpose: to examine the evidence and produce a definitive official account of what happened that fatal night. More than 100 individuals were called to testify under oath, surviving officers including Second Officer Charles Lytler, Managing Director J. Bruce Ismay, engineers, crew members, passengers from every class, and leading experts in naval architecture. Thousands of questions were asked, probing every aspect of the disaster: the ship's speed through ice-filled waters, the inadequate number of lifeboats, the handling of iceberg warnings, the sequence of events from the moment of impact to the final disappearance of the vessel. According to both the final report of the United States Senate and the British Wreck Commissioners' inquiry,
when they found Isidore's body, they found a locket with the initials Isidore Strauss.
the physical sequence of the sinking was established as follows. After striking the iceberg, the forward watertight compartments were breached and water flooded in at an uncontrollable rate. The bow descended slowly but unstoppably. As it sank, the stern rose out of the sea to a steep angle. And then, both inquiries agreed, the hull retained its full structural integrity until the very end. The British report stated it plainly. The ship sank to the bottom of the ocean intact. That conclusion became the foundation of all public and professional understanding of Titanic for the next 73 years. Not a theory. Established fact, verified by the highest authorities, written into history books, taught in schools, accepted without serious challenge by generations of maritime historians and engineers. Any departure from that narrative was dismissed as baseless speculation, the product of confused memory or emotional distress. The case in physical terms was considered closed. Here's the catch: the people who were actually there told a completely different story. And what was done with their testimony is something the official record has never fully had to answer for. If what you're about to hear makes you wonder what else has been quietly buried in plain sight, subscribe now. The survivor testimony we're about to get into is only the beginning. The voices they chose to ignore, hidden deep inside the thousands of pages of raw testimony from those official inquiries, buried beneath the confident conclusions of the final reports, are the voices of the people who were actually there, drifting in the frozen darkness of the North Atlantic, watching from lifeboats as the largest ship in the world died in front of them. What they describe stands in direct and complete conflict with the official narrative. Jack Thayer was 17 years old when the Titanic sank. A first-class passenger, he survived by leaping into the freezing water and clinging to an overturned lifeboat. Years later, he described the ship's final moments with astonishing clarity. He recalled the vessel rising to an angle he estimated at between 50 and 60 degrees, and then, hanging in the air for one horrifying instant, the ship broke in two. The stern fell back, and then it sank as well. Separately, independently, a full 269-meter ship, split apart in the dark. His testimony was not unique. Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking officer to survive the disaster and a key witness in both inquiries, described hearing a terrible roar of tearing metal rising from deep within the ship as it made its final plunge. He described sounds no boiler explosion could fully account for, sounds that came from the structure of the vessel itself, failing. And get this, Lightoller was not some traumatized bystander. He was the second officer, a professional mariner with decades of experience identifying sounds at sea, a man whose entire career was built on precisely this kind of observation. Ordinary passengers in the lifeboats repeated similar accounts. They spoke of a great explosion, a sound like thunder from within the hull, a sudden catastrophic event in the final moments before the lights vanished. These testimonies came from people of different nationalities, different social classes, watching from different positions across hundreds of meters of freezing water. And yet, they all described the same essential phenomenon. The ship did not sink quietly. It tore itself apart. Here's what the investigators in both Washington and London decided to do with all of that. They dismissed it, systematically. Within the formal atmosphere of the hearing rooms, these accounts were ruled to be the product of extreme psychological trauma, confusion caused by near-total darkness, the violent chaos of sounds coming from a dying ship. It was argued that from the distance of a lifeboat, no witness could have accurately registered what was happening to the vessel's structure. The sounds were explained away, boilers exploding as cold seawater rushed in, heavy machinery breaking loose and crashing through the interior decks. In essence, the system was confronted with a choice: trust the calculations of engineers and naval design experts who insisted the ship had been built too strongly to break apart, or trust the eyes and ears of the people who were there. They chose the experts. The survivors were pushed into the shadows of history, their accounts labeled unreliable, their memories dismissed as the distorted impressions of traumatized minds. The official narrative was sealed, and for 73 years, it remained untouched. But here's what nobody expected. The survivors hadn't misremembered anything. The search that changed everything. 7 decades is a long time for an official story to harden into something almost immovable, not merely accepted as truth, but treated as doctrine. The ignored accounts had become footnotes, curiosities for devoted researchers, but not enough to threaten the established record. Then, in the summer of 1985, a new generation of explorers set out to attempt what many had considered impossible: to find the physical grave of Titanic. Robert Ballard led a joint expedition between the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the United States and IOFREMER, the French Research Institute for Exploitation of the Sea. They deployed a towed unmanned vehicle called Argo, equipped with side-scan sonar, capable of mapping the seafloor in extraordinary detail, and cameras that could transmit live images from nearly 4 kilometers below the surface. The entire search strategy was built on the same assumption that had gone unchallenged for 73 years. They were looking for a single enormous object, an intact hull. Computer models predicted where a whole ship might have settled, factoring in the last known wireless position, ocean currents, estimated sinking speed. They were not searching for a structural mystery. They were searching for a complete ship. For weeks, Argo swept back and forth across the search zone in methodical passes, while the crew aboard the research vessel, Connor, watched screens showing nothing but the gray monotony of mud and clay. Tension built steadily as the expedition consumed its final days with nothing to show. And get this, the first thing they found was not a ship at all. It was a boiler, a single massive boiler, sitting in isolation on the ocean floor, far from where any intact wreck should have been. Then more debris appeared, twisted metal, piles of coal, a suitcase, forming a long, scattered trail across the seabed. The very first physical evidence from the site of Titanic was not a shipwreck preserved in one piece. It was a debris field, an immediate, undeniable signature of disintegration. Here's what that meant: the central assumption behind the entire mission, the same assumption that had shaped the official story for 73 years, was wrong. Whatever had happened to Titanic in her final moments, it had not been orderly. And now there was physical evidence spread across the ocean floor to prove it. But nobody knew yet just how wrong the story had been. That revelation was still ahead of them, approximately 600 meters further along the debris trail, and what Argo's cameras would find there was something no one had prepared themselves to see. Proof the world could no longer deny. Ballard's team changed course immediately, redirecting Argo along the direction where the debris grew denser, operating on the belief that the heaviest sections of the ship would lie at the far end of that trail. The waiting aboard Nor was almost unbearable, the control room quiet except for the low hum of electronic equipment and the occasional burst of communication from the sonar operators. Then, through the grain and interference of the video feed, transmitting from nearly 4 kilometers, below, a vast dark shape began to materialize from the blackness. Ballard leaned toward the monitor. At first, indistinct, just a shadow, then unmistakable, the bow of the Titanic. Even coated in 73 years of rust and encrusted biological growth, even damaged by its violent impact with the seabed, the majesty was impossible to deny. The railings still stood. The forward mast had collapsed, but the crow's nest bell remained, silent, intact, a haunting reminder of the lookouts who had tried to give warning. Ballard later described the moment as awe so profound it was almost grief. He stood in the control room with tears on his face, staring at a ship that had been lost before his parents were born. The images were broadcast around the world within hours and dominated headlines on every continent. But here's the catch. Inside that same control room, amid all the triumph of discovery, an urgent and deeply troubling question had already surfaced. If this was the bow, where was the rest of a ship that had been 269 meters long? The bow section ended decisively. There was no stern attached, no continuous hull, just a clean line of fracture somewhere aft of the third funnel, and then nothing. They reprogrammed Argo's course, moving in the opposite direction from the bow, following the debris trail deeper into the darkness. At a distance of approximately 600 meters, another massive sonar target appeared. When Argo's cameras turned toward it, Ballard went quiet. This was not a recognizable section of a ship. It bore almost no resemblance to anything that had once been the stern of the largest ocean liner ever built. The decks had collapsed into one another like a crushed accordion. Massive steel plates from the outer hull had been bent outward and torn open, as though they were made of paper. It was a chaotic heap of metal, barely identifiable, barely coherent, a scrapyard assembled by some unimaginable violence. It was the stern of Titanic, and before we talk about what that meant, really meant, for everyone who had been telling the story for 73 years, you need to sit with that image for a moment. Because what Argo's cameras had just transmitted from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean was not a damaged ship section. It was physical proof of something that had been actively and systematically denied. Why the truth had to be suppressed, once the physical reality was undeniable, once no one could claim the ship had sunk intact. The system did what systems do when confronted with a disruptive truth that threatens their foundations. It didn't admit the error. It absorbed the fact and surrounded it with a new explanation. A revised narrative quickly took shape, circulated through documentaries, scientific journals, and engineering analyses. This new story did not deny the break. It acknowledged it, then immediately offered a rational, technically credible account of why it happened. The bow, filling with water, acted as a pivot point, creating an enormous lever effect on the midsection of the hull. The stern, filled with trapped air, was lifted higher and higher at an ever steeper angle. The bending stress at that point eventually exceeded the structural limits of the steel, and the hull failed. Then, as the stern sank alone, pockets of trapped air were crushed by increasing water pressure, causing the catastrophic internal collapse that produced the devastated heap we see today. This explanation is entirely plausible. It fits the laws of physics. It aligns with computer simulations. And get this, it also performs a second function, one far more subtle and far more important than explaining the physics. By supplying a satisfying, definitive answer to the question of what happened to the stern after the break, the new narrative quietly redirected attention away from the far more dangerous question. Why did the hull break in the first place? That question leads somewhere uncomfortable. It leads to questions about the quality of the steel in Titanic's construction, whether the rivets were made from inferior materials to cut costs at Harland and Wolff, whether the expansion joints in the hull were adequate. These are the questions that would have led, in 1912, to catastrophic legal liability for the White Star Line, and a fundamental crisis of confidence in the British shipbuilding industry, one of the central pillars of the empire. But here's what nobody expected the 1912 inquiries to do, and this is the part that changes everything about how you read the official record. The investigators in Washington and London were not working without information. They had before them dozens of direct, consistent eyewitness accounts from people who said they had watched the ship break apart. They heard descriptions of tearing metal, of the stern rising and splitting. They chose, consciously, systematically, to set aside that entire body of testimony and endorse a completely opposite version of events, one that more comfortably preserved the image of a perfectly built ship, brought down only by an unforeseeable act of nature. That is not an error born of incomplete information. That is a decision, the selection of one version of the truth over another. And the question it leaves behind is not about bending stress or steel composition. The question it leaves behind is this: why was the truth so dangerous in 1912 that it had to be replaced? The stern has always known. In the end, after moving through layers of history, buried testimony, and evidence from the deep sea floor, we return to the question this video started with. Why does no one talk about Titanic's back half? The real answer is not that the stern is ugly or structurally uninteresting or somehow less cinematic than the bow. The silence runs far deeper than aesthetics, and its roots are historical. The stern is the physical artifact of the original lie. To look honestly at that, shattered wreck is not merely to observe a damaged section of a ship. It is to stare at proof that the system failed not once, but twice. First, when it allowed a ship with possible hidden structural weaknesses to sail under an aura of absolute invincibility. And second, when it actively and methodically buried the truth of that failure beneath the weight of official authority, expert consensus, and institutional reputation. Consider what would have happened in 1912 if the truth had been admitted. If the official inquiries had concluded that Titanic broke in two, the entire story would have transformed. It would no longer stand as a grand tragedy about the struggle between man and nature, a narrative that, however painful, preserves the dignity of the builders. Instead, it would have become a humiliating story of human failure, a failure of engineering, a possible failure of materials and cost-cutting decisions, a failure of the technological arrogance that believed the ocean had been fully mastered. Such a narrative would have destroyed the White Star Line financially and reputationally. It would have triggered enormous legal consequences the company and its insurers could not have survived. And most critically, it would have shaken public confidence in the entire shipbuilding industry at a moment when that industry was central to British imperial power. Faced with that prospect, a simpler, cleaner, more controllable story was chosen. A single iceberg, nature's power rather than human fallibility. The reputation of the builders, the operators, and the regulators largely intact. And get this, that same protective impulse, in a more sophisticated form, continues today. We are no longer given the crude original lie that the ship sank intact. We are given a technically credible explanation for what happened after the break that keeps us from pressing too hard on why the break happened at all. The function of the silence has evolved. The silence itself has not. The most important half of Titanic is the half nobody photographs, the half nobody builds models of. The half that appears briefly in documentaries before the camera moves on to safer, more photogenic ground. The reason no one talks about Titanic's back half is not because there is nothing to say. It's because everything it says is something someone, at some point, very much needed the world not to hear. The most dangerous wreck is not always the one lying at the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes it lies within our own official records, silent, patient, and waiting to be uncovered. If this story made you rethink what it means when institutions close an investigation and call it truth, share it. The pattern we trace through the Titanic inquiry is not unique to 1912 and not unique to ships. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling at the thread, because we are just getting started.